Every person you've ever slept with is still psychologically inside you. Not metaphorically, neurologically. Your nervous system remembers every intimate touch, every emotional pattern, every shadow they carried. Carl Jung called this psychic contamination, but modern neuroscience has an even more disturbing explanation. Your brain literally rewires itself around intimate partners, creating neural pathways that persist for years after they're gone. This is ArcheVoid, where we explore the dark intersection of depth psychology and human consciousness. And today, we're going into territory that most people aren't ready to face. The psychological mechanics of what actually happens when you let someone inside your body. I need to tell you about Sarah, a patient described in attachment research who could still feel her ex-boyfriend's emotional states 3 years after their breakup. Not his memory, his actual emotions. When he was anxious, she felt anxious. When he was depressed, she felt the weight. The researchers thought she was delusional until brain scans showed something remarkable. Her neural patterns had been so deeply imprinted by their relationship. Her nervous system was still attuned to his, despite having no contact. They were psychologically fused at a level deeper than conscious awareness. This isn't some New Age energy talk. This is hard neuroscience meeting depth psychology. Every intimate relationship creates what attachment theorists call internal working models, psychological templates that shape how you experience reality itself. John Bowlby discovered this studying children, but the implications for adult intimacy are staggering. When you engage sexually with someone, you're not just exchanging fluids or energy. You're literally downloading their psychological operating system into your unconscious. Think about your past relationships. That anxiety that seems to come from nowhere, that might be your ex-partner's unresolved trauma. That self-doubt that wasn't there before. Could be their inner critic, now living rent-free in your psyche. That destructive pattern you can't seem to break. You might be unconsciously replaying someone else's psychological program. We live in an age where dating apps have turned intimacy into a commodity, where people collect sexual experiences like trophies. But here's what nobody tells you. Your psyche doesn't have a delete button. Every person you bond with intimately leaves a psychological fingerprint that becomes part of your unconscious architecture. You're walking around carrying the ghosts of every person who ever had access to your vulnerability. The modern world has forgotten what ancient traditions always knew, that sexual union is psychological surgery. When you let someone inside your body, you're giving them access to your unconscious mind. The tantric traditions weren't being mystical when they talked about energy exchange. They were describing psychological processes that we're only now beginning to understand. But here's where it gets truly dark. It's not just their conscious personality you're absorbing, it's their shadow, to use Jung's term. The shadow is everything a person has repressed, denied or disowned about themselves. Their unacknowledged rage, their hidden trauma, their unconscious patterns of destruction. During intimate merger, these shadow elements transfer between psyches like psychological viruses, infecting your unconscious with material that was never yours to begin with. You know that couple who starts to look alike after years together? That's not just about shared habits. They've literally exchanged so much psychological material that they've become psychologically hybridized. Their unconscious minds have merged to the point where they're no longer two distinct psychological entities, but a fused psychological system. This is beautiful when it's conscious and healthy, but most of the time it's neither. The attachment system that evolution gave us to bond with caregivers gets hijacked in adult sexual relationships. Your brain doesn't distinguish between the vulnerability of infancy and the vulnerability of sexual intimacy. The same neural circuits fire. This is why a toxic relationship can feel as essential as a parent to a child. Your nervous system has coded this person as necessary for survival. And once those neural pathways are established, they don't just disappear when the relationship ends. Neuroscientists have found that it takes approximately 7 years for the brain to fully rewire itself after a deep, intimate bond. 7 years. That's not 7 years to get over someone emotionally. That's 7 years for your neural architecture to fully differentiate from theirs. You're literally walking around with someone else's psychological wiring running through your nervous system, influencing your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. This brings us to something even more disturbing, that Jung discovered in his work with patients. He noticed that people in intimate relationships don't just project their own unconscious material onto their partners. They actually absorb their partner's unconscious material into themselves. He called this participation mystique, a state where two psyches become so entangled that individual boundaries dissolve at the unconscious level. Let me explain what this actually means for you. Every person carries what Jung called complexes, clusters of psychological energy formed around unresolved experiences. When you become intimate with someone, these complexes don't stay neatly contained. They transfer. That partner who had abandonment issues, you're now carrying their abandonment complex. That lover with the critical mother, her voice is now part of your inner dialogue. You haven't just slept with them, you've psychologically merged with their entire unconscious inheritance. This is what the existentialist philosophers understood about human relationships. Sartre wrote that hell is other people, but he wasn't being misanthropic. He was describing the existential trap of intimate relationships. When you let another person's gaze define you, you lose your authentic existence. You become what they see, what they project, what they need you to be. And in sexual intimacy, this isn't just philosophical, it's neurological. De Beauvoir took this further, examining how women especially lose themselves in relationships, not just socially but existentially. She saw that in the act of making oneself an object of desire, one risks becoming only that object, losing subjecthood entirely. The sexual gaze doesn't just objectify, it colonizes consciousness itself. You start seeing yourself through your partner's eyes, judging yourself by their standards, living in their reality rather than your own. But here's the truly insidious part: trauma bonding. When someone treats you inconsistently, when they alternate between affection and rejection, your brain responds with a cocktail of chemicals that creates the strongest form of attachment. Cortisol from the stress, dopamine from the unpredictability, oxytocin from the moments of connection. This combination is more addictive than cocaine. You're not weak, you're neurologically addicted. The trauma bond is stronger than love because it engages your survival systems. Your brain literally cannot tell the difference between this person and survival itself. Think about your most toxic relationship. Remember how impossible it felt to leave. How even thinking about leaving created physical panic. That wasn't love. That was your nervous system in withdrawal from a neurological addiction. The person who hurt you most has the deepest psychological hooks in your unconscious, because trauma creates deeper imprints than pleasure. This is the dark irony of human attachment. We bond most strongly to those who wound us. The Eastern traditions understood this dynamic. When they spoke of karma, they weren't talking about cosmic justice. They were describing psychological inheritance. Every intimate encounter creates karmic threads, psychological connections that bind you to another person's unconscious patterns. What you call chemistry is often just your trauma recognizing their trauma, your shadows calling to their shadows. The concept of energy centers or chakras. These aren't mystical vortexes. They're psychological centers where we store different aspects of experience. The root chakra is about basic trust and safety, exactly what gets disrupted in toxic relationships. The sacral chakra is about sexuality and creativity, precisely what gets colonized in unconscious merger. These ancient maps were describing psychological anatomy that Western psychology is only now beginning to understand. And here's something that will disturb you even more. That ex you can't stop thinking about. They might be thinking about you too, but not consciously. At the unconscious level, you're still psychologically entangled. Jung documented cases where former lovers would have synchronized dreams, parallel life events, mysterious illnesses at the same time. This explains why certain people come back into your life at specific moments. It's not fate, it's psychological timing. When you go through certain developmental phases, you activate psychological material that's connected to specific past partners. They feel this activation at an unconscious level, and suddenly you're both thinking about each other, both reaching out, convinced it's meaningful. But it's just your merged psychological systems responding to the same unconscious triggers. So how do we break free from this psychological colonization? How do we reclaim our unconscious from the ghosts of past lovers? Jung gave us the answer through his concept of individuation, the process of becoming a distinct psychological individual rather than an unconscious merger of various psychological influences. The first step is brutal honesty about what you're carrying that isn't yours. You need to map your psychological inheritance. That fear of abandonment, is it yours, or did it come from someone else's psychology? That critical inner voice, whose parent is actually speaking? That sexual shame, which partner's repression are you carrying? This isn't therapy, this is psychological archaeology, excavating layers of other people's unconscious material from your psyche. Here's what most therapists won't tell you. Traditional talk therapy often fails with intimate trauma because the imprints aren't stored in the narrative mind. They're stored in the body, in the nervous system, in what we call implicit memory. You can understand intellectually that someone was bad for you while your nervous system still craves them like a drug. This is why you need somatic work, body-based healing, that speaks directly to the nervous system where these psychological ghosts actually live. The process of psychological divorce from a past partner requires what Jung called shadow work. You have to identify not just what you projected onto them, but what they projected onto you that you unconsciously accepted. Every relationship involves a shadow dance where we see in the other what we can't see in ourselves. But in intimate merger, we don't just see it, we absorb it. Their shadow becomes our shadow. Their demons become our demons. Let me give you a practical example. Sarah, who I mentioned earlier, went through a process of psychological differentiation. She had to literally map out which thoughts were hers and which belonged to her ex-partner's psychological system. She discovered that her sudden anxiety attacks matched his work schedule. Her depressive episodes aligned with his family visits. She wasn't crazy. She was psychologically possessed by someone else's unconscious patterns. The treatment? She had to consciously withdraw her projections while also rejecting his. She had to energetically vomit up years of absorbed psychological material. Through EMDR, somatic experiencing, and depth psychology work, she gradually separated her nervous system from his. It took 2 years of intensive work to achieve what she called psychological sovereignty. The moment she realized she was finally alone in her own mind again. This is the path of conscious relationship that nobody teaches us. Before you can truly love another, you must first belong completely to yourself. Before you can engage in healthy intimacy, you must achieve psychological sovereignty. This doesn't mean avoiding connection. It means connecting from wholeness rather than wounding, from fullness rather than emptiness. The philosopher Martin Buber distinguished between I-it relationships and I-thou relationships. Most sexual relationships are I-it. We use the other as an object to fill our emptiness, to complete our incompleteness, to avoid facing our own shadow. But I-thou relationship requires 2 whole beings meeting in full presence, without projection, without merger, without psychological colonization. This is conscious intimacy, rare, difficult, but ultimately the only form of love that doesn't destroy individuality. Here's the framework for conscious intimacy that emerges from this understanding. First, you need psychological boundaries, not walls, but semi-permeable membranes that allow connection while maintaining distinction. Think of it as your psychological immune system. You need to be able to recognize what's you and what's not you, what belongs in your psyche and what's an invasion. Second, you need to read attachment patterns before engaging intimately. This isn't about judgment, it's about awareness. Is this person securely attached, or are they carrying unresolved trauma that will colonize your unconscious? Are they capable of maintaining their own psychological boundaries, or will they merge and lose themselves? Are you choosing them from your wholeness, or is your trauma recognizing their trauma? Third, and this is crucial, you need regular psychological hygiene. Just as you shower to clean your body, you need practices to clean your psyche of accumulated psychological material from others. This could be meditation, journaling, therapy, somatic work. Whatever helps you return to your own psychological center. The ancient practices of purification weren't primitive superstition. They were technologies for maintaining psychological sovereignty in a world of constant psychic contamination. The ultimate paradox of intimacy is this. We need connection to become ourselves, but connection threatens to dissolve ourselves. We're wired for attachment, but attachment can destroy our individuality. We seek completion in another, but that very seeking prevents us from ever being complete. This is the existential koan of human relationships that Eastern wisdom and Western psychology are only now beginning to solve together. The solution isn't celibacy or emotional isolation. That's just another form of unconsciousness. The solution is what I call conscious intimacy, the ability to connect deeply while maintaining psychological sovereignty. To love without losing yourself. To merge at the physical level while remaining distinct at the psychological level. This requires a level of consciousness that most people never develop because nobody teaches us that this is even possible. Think about it. We get sex education about the mechanics of bodies, but no one teaches us about the mechanics of psyches in intimacy. We learn about STDs, but not about psychological transmission. We're taught about consent for physical acts, but not about unconscious psychological invasion. We're walking around psychologically naked in a world full of unconscious predators and prey, merging and colonizing each other's minds without any awareness of what we're doing. Here's your wake-up call. Every person you choose to be intimate with is a choice about who you're going to become psychologically. You're not just choosing a Friday night. You're choosing neural pathways that will influence your thoughts for years. You're not just choosing pleasure. You're choosing which shadows you'll absorb, which traumas you'll inherit, which unconscious patterns will colonize your psyche. This changes everything about how we approach relationships. Instead of asking, is this person hot? Ask, is this person's unconscious something I want living in my mind? Instead of wondering if there's chemistry, wonder, is this trauma bonding or genuine compatibility? Instead of seeking someone to complete you, seek someone who inspires you to complete yourself. The transformation available here is profound. When you understand the psychological mechanics of intimacy, you can finally stop repeating unconscious patterns. You can stop attracting the same type disguised as different people. You can stop losing yourself in relationships and start finding yourself through them. But this requires doing the work that most people will never do, the work of becoming psychologically sovereign before seeking union. Let me leave you with this. There's a reason why all the ancient traditions emphasized purification before sacred union. They understood that sex without consciousness is psychological contamination, but sex with consciousness, that's a path to individuation, to becoming more yourself rather than less. When two psychologically sovereign beings come together in full awareness, without projection, without unconscious merger, something transcendent happens. Not the loss of self, but the multiplication of self. Not codependence, but co-creation. The question you need to ask yourself is this: are you willing to do the psychological work required for conscious intimacy? Are you ready to face your own shadow instead of finding it in others? Can you tolerate the discomfort of being psychologically alone long enough to become whole? Because until you can, every relationship will be an unconscious attempt to avoid yourself, and you'll keep exchanging shadows in the dark, wondering why love always feels like losing yourself. Your ex isn't gone. They're encoded in your nervous system, living in your neural pathways, speaking through your inner dialogue. Every past lover is a psychological ghost haunting your unconscious. But you have the power to exorcise them, to reclaim your psychological sovereignty, to choose who has access to your unconscious mind. This isn't just about better relationships. This is about the fundamental question of who you are versus who you've unconsciously become through psychological contamination. The work starts now. Map your psychological inheritance. Identify whose patterns you're carrying. Begin the process of psychological differentiation. Reclaim your projections. Establish boundaries. Develop practices for psychological hygiene. And most importantly, commit to becoming whole before seeking another half. Because the truth that changes everything is this: you were never half to begin with. You were always whole. You just forgot in the process of unconsciously merging with others. This is ArcheVoid, where we don't just explore ideas, we explore the depths of what makes us human. If this video disturbed something in you, good. That's your unconscious recognizing truth. Share this with someone who needs to hear it before their next relationship becomes their next psychological possession. Subscribe if you're ready to go deeper into the darkness where psychology meets philosophy, meets the human soul. And remember, in the end, the only relationship that truly matters is the one you have with your own unconscious. The choice, as always, is yours. Choose wisely, your psyche depends on it.